We're moving on to chapter 13. Chapter 13 is say the other bookend for chapter 12. Chapter 12 we talked about mitosis and the phases of mitosis. This information is going to sound very familiar because it goes through much of the same phases. What it does is it goes through it twice, and this is meiosis, which you will hear me pronounce meiosis every once in a while just to keep your head straight that this is a different system than mitosis. So meiosis, and also the way different living organisms reproduce, so the sexual life cycles. And the idea behind the creation of a gamete is that we have variety, we have variation in inheritance. We learned way back in chapter 1, I believe it was, is that one of the properties, one of the features of life is that you have to be able to pass on your genetic data to the generation after yourself. And there are various different ways that genetic data can get passed on. We happen to be spending most of this chapter talking about sexual reproduction. So when we say sexual reproduction, we're going to end up talking about gametes that then get together to form a whole new organism. And one of the images you have here is the variety that is created when you have sexual reproduction. Those varieties can be beneficial. Certainly the white tiger, if it's living in a very cold environment where there's a lot of snow, that's a very good thing. But if the white tiger is living in the jungle, not such a good thing. And in terms of the giraffes, that variety with regard to neck length is useful because it opens up different areas that can be eaten. And speaking of being eaten, with regard to the ladybugs or lady beetles, whether a bird or somebody who might come by and eat them recognizes them by food with this variety of color in their outer appearance. So a couple of terms that show up right away early in this chapter is the idea of genetics. Genetics is the study of heredity and variation. So genetics is the scientific study of heredity and variation. And genetics is very, very popular now in terms of getting the genetic, I guess the background genes of different individuals. And there are many companies that allow you to send in a cheek cell or something with DNA in it, and you find out what your heritage is. Those are not as scientific as, say, something where you're studying it in a lab with some very highly sophisticated research tools. But it is genetics, and it expands the conversation. Heredity is defined as the transmission of traits from one generation to the next. So this, even though these four tigers look different, they also look very much the same. So this transmission of traits, this trait of a tiger, its general shape of its head, the fact that it has hair, the fact that it has a predisposition for stripes on, I mean, not hair, fur, sorry. So the traits are generally the same between all four, even though there's variety. And then variation is demonstrated by differences, and we can see the differences not only in these four siblings, but from the parents to the siblings. These four siblings of tigers or the giraffes or the lady beetles could have been look just like one of them, whereas we will find out as we learn more about meiosis is there's a chance you have a single set of parents, biological male, female, and there's something like 1 trillion chances of what that particular offspring of that biological male and female will end up looking like or manifesting physically. When you think about the capacity for variety with sexual reproduction, it's actually more of a surprised that babies look like their parents than not looking like their parents. Um, Speaking of children, they don't physically inherit particular traits from their parents. Your book talks about when people refer to a child has its mother's nose, its father's eyes. Those aren't specifically inherited, but what you have are genes that are inherited. Certainly, the biological mother and father have only to pass on their genes. So that is definitely inherited in the child, but what gets expressed and in what variety is where the mix comes in. But we won't get too far off that track. Genes are the units of heredity. And made up of DNA. So again, just let me remind you that much of what you are trying to master in this class, certainly, hopefully the class is very interesting to you, but you're trying to master what terms mean and how they relate one to the other, I guess you might say. The word genes sometimes can be synonymous with your entire genome. Genome is all of the DNA that you inherit, or sometimes it can be ascribed to just specific traits in a term. So you have the genes for a very muscular build or something like that. So the word genes are units, I guess, and the variety comes in what kind of units you're talking about. But they are made up of DNA. And they are passed via reproductive cells called gametes. There's that word. And they are generally considered sperm and eggs. Sometimes they'll just be considered male and female gametes. I'm speaking of more than just humans. And then another term on those genes, those units of heredity, there's a specific place where that has been isolated, that is the place that gives you a particular trait. I don't want to say eye color, even though I have eye color here, because it can be, but I guess we can say it with eye color. There's a particular spot on that chromosome that when that is passed on, the eye color, as long as it's dominant, will be expressed in the baby. And that's this word called locus or loci, depending on whether it's plural or singular. And those are found throughout the entire chromosomes, the entire genome. So remember, we have 23 pair, 46 individual chromosomes, and on those chromosomes are very long, each one. Each one is going to have a sequence of nucleotides that make up the locus. So there are infinite numbers of loci on a particular genome. And then the DNA is packaged into chromosomes. Some of these terms we're already very familiar with, very comfortable with, but this particular slide, you picked up this word locus and maybe the definition of genes. One of the things that your book goes into, and I didn't include the picture, I should have because it was kind of a cool picture, is asexual reproduction. With regard to, just to refresh your memory, a single individual passes its genes onto its offspring without gametes. And what happens is basically a clone. We're talking about binary fission. Remember, we had binary fission of bacteria, of some prokaryotes, and the picture you have in your book, which is kind of nice, you have a hydra and then a redwood tree. And it's the hydra actually just buds off. There isn't even any binary fission or anything. It just buds off, and so that bud is going to have exactly the same genome. And then with regard to a redwood, it's almost like shoots go up, but it isn't really shoots. It's just, yeah, I guess you would say a redwood is like shoots from the parent tree. So the clone is a group of genetically identical individuals from the same parent, and genetically the same genome. Sexual reproduction, two parents give rise to an offspring that then has a unique combination of genes inherited from each of the parents. So not only the combination of the parents, but also in the process of meiosis, there is this incident called crossing over, that actually there then can be even more variety because of that. Life cycle, in terms of how long it takes for the genetic material to be passed one to the next. So life cycle is a generation to generation sequence. And this means that from one generation to the next, that particular DNA can be passed along. With regard to human somatic cells, remember soma cells are your body cells. Other than gametes, gametes are just your sex cells. They have 23 pairs of chromosomes. One of the reasons why I keep saying that is because that can be confusing. It's 23 pairs, and you have the karyotype over here. It's the on the far right. This is the human genome karyotype, the set of chromosomes, and if you can count them, they're 23 pair, and they each part of the pair, you inherited half of that pair from your mother, half from your father, biologically. And so the karyotype is an ordered display of the pairs of chromosomes from a cell. Ordered because they're numbered 1 to 23. And we even talk about them. We'll talk about a particular loci that's found on, say, chromosome number 22. So this organization helps to define where you are. It's like a GPS of chromosomes, you might say. When two chromosomes that have been inherited from the mother and the father in the pair, they're called homologous chromosomes, or homologs. The chromosomes in a homologous pair are the same length, the same shape, and carry genes controlling the same inherited characters. So let's look at that a little bit more specifically. So you have each of these 23 sets. They are homologous chromosomes. You have inherited one from the biological mother, one from the father. They have paired up because on each of those, at a specific spot or loci, you're going to have the trait for, say, eye color, or a trait for eyelash length, I guess you might say, something benign like that. The reason I'm picking benign things because many of the traits are multiple loci going on, but you will have one that you inherited from your biological mother, one from the biological father, both lining up at the same spot. So these are not the same chromosomes, but the arrangement and the details that you have with regard to what those chromosomes can produce are the same. And that's where we get this idea of the homologs or homologous pair. Sex chromosomes are different. Those were the soma chromosomes we're talking about. They're going to determine the sex of the individual, which are called X and Y. And females are going to have a homologous pair of XX, males XY. The remaining 22 are called autosomes, and I think we're going to have to leave it there and pick it up on the next one.